What's up, APUSH Nation? Happy Halloween. Hope you guys are having a spooktacular day. I'm recording this on Monday, so pardon the punny intro here. But let's get down to business for what is going to be our fireside chat tonight, which the topic is going to be George Washington's presidency and some of the early issues the new United States faced. So let's get to it. Okay, so we can take a lot of life lessons away from the presidency of George Washington when it comes to leadership. And one of the first topics I'm going to hit here is the all-star ensemble. I mean, just one of the greatest cabinets ever assembled in American history. As Washington became the first president of the United States following his election in 1788 after the Constitution's ratification, Washington appointed, with Senate approval, because the Senate is the member of Congress that approves presidential nominations, not just to the cabinet, but also to the Supreme Court and lower courts as well. Washington nominated and had one of the greatest ensemble, like all-star cast of cabinet members in history. His vice president was John Adams. And by the way, back then, the vice president was the runner-up in the presidential election. That was part of the Electoral College compromise my class talked about on Tuesday. So Adams became his vice president by default. Adams would be Washington's vice president for 2 terms. Now, could you imagine today if that system still remained the same? In fact, it took the 12th Amendment to the Constitution to change the system of the vice presidency. So if we had the same system they did back in 1788 and 1792 when Washington won his first 2 presidencies, Donald Trump would have been Joe Biden's vice president. And conversely, going back to 2016, Hillary Clinton would have been Donald Trump's vice president. It would have been a wild scenario that gets a history and government teacher like me feeling kind of nerdy about the what ifs. But anyways, let's get back to the topic at hand here. So Washington's cabinet, John Adams, and the vice president, by the way, is a member of the cabinet. His Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, a marvelous decision, although Jefferson and Washington would eventually have a falling out. His Secretary of War, before there was a Department of Defense, it was called the Department of War. That was Henry Knox. His Attorney General, who's the head of the Department of Justice, was Edmund Randolph. And then, and we're going to foreshadow this for later discussion on this fireside chat, his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Amazing cast of characters who would help shape the early policies of the nascent United States. And really, GW deserves a lot of credit for putting together this rock star cast of characters who are going to help shape policies that will affect the United States all the way up until the present times. More on that later. But let's talk about the issues that was facing Washington in the first couple terms of his presidency. Washington was elected in 1788 and 1792 through the Electoral College. Little dinner party knowledge here. He's the only president in American history to receive 100% of the Electoral College votes. There were no one else that received votes except for George Washington. But what was going on in Washington's presidency that would challenge him? We're going to split up here. So let's divide it into domestic and foreign issues. And I'll start with the latter. We're going to start with foreign issues. The chief foreign issue that raged throughout George Washington's presidency and began in the late 1780s hit very close to home. The French, who had suffered an immense economic collapse due to its participation in the Revolutionary War, which, as we talked about in the previous fireside chat, would never have been possible if it wasn't for the assistance of the French military and French government. But shortly after the United States broke away from England, France engaged in its own revolution to overthrow its monarch, and that resulted in a tumultuous and violent decade-long quest to eradicate the monarchy that ultimately ended up really being back in the same position where the French were before the revolution began in the late 1700s. Many of those cast of characters who participated in the American Revolution, including the Marquis de Lafayette, were critical in France's revolution, and therefore Washington and the United States felt a very strong tug to join in the French Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, was one of the strongest proponents of advocating for American support in the French Revolution. However, when the French Revolution turned violent and the Reign of Terror and chopping off the heads of kings, queens, and basically anyone who was against the revolution became the norm, Washington steered clear of that nightmarish, bloody mess. And so therefore, he did not intervene and give any American support whatsoever. He remained neutral in the French Revolution. So that was a critical issue. And it actually was the wedge that began to sever the relationship between Washington and his allies, as well as Thomas Jefferson, foreshadowing more events upcoming. The other issue that continued to plague the United States was the British. The British just wouldn't leave. We already mentioned that in the last fireside chat. They remained embedded in the Northwest Territory, which today is the modern-day Midwestern United States. And as a result of continued British presence in the Northwest Territory, the British began to ally with Native American groups there, and thus began a similar pattern we saw after the French and Indian War, where new territory, new land expansion leads to greater conflict with Native groups. And the quintessential example of this was the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which was a massively important and bloody conflict battle that emerged in modern-day Ohio in the Northwest Territory, where Washington sent the military to intervene against a Native uprising, which was supported by the British. So even though the United States won the Battle of Fallen Timbers, still you're dealing with the fact that British just won't get off our land, and that's going to cause a major conflict eventually in the War of 1812. The third foreign issue that Washington has to deal with is increasing Spanish presence. Spain had long ago conquered the New World in many regions, including the Southeast, like Florida, Louisiana, Texas, all the way out into California. But as Spain sought to increase its presence, especially with the French gone, the United States and Spain were nearly on the brink of war during Washington's second presidency, when in 1795, Washington sent one of his ambassadors to negotiate a treaty, and this treaty became known as Pinckney's Treaty. Pinckney's Treaty was key in mitigating an all-out war with Spain, in which the United States recognized Spanish control of Florida. However, the U.S. gained important trade rights on the Mississippi River, which had long been a part of both French and Spanish territory. So getting access to the Mississippi was a clutch move by the American government in an early stage of its economic growth. But Pinckney's Treaty was vital to also quelling any of the rising tensions that existed between Spain and the United States. And so those three issues are really chief issues, quintessential concerns that Washington has as he's shepherding the nascent United States into this new era. But now we're going to turn it over and talk about domestic issues. So while problems abroad and even on the United States' home soil seemed like they were giving George Washington all he could handle, Washington was also dealing with some domestic issues, especially stabilizing the United States after it had gone through that tumultuous critical period and over the furious debate of the Constitution. State governments proved that they would not let go of a lot of the power that the Constitution vested within the states. And so therefore, as Washington hits his first and second presidency terms, you start to have to deal with this issue of federalism. Federalism is this very unique concept that was ingrained in the Constitution, in which the federal government was supreme over the states, but the states were given certain autonomy to pass their own constitutions, to pass their own laws. And so long as there was no conflict between state and federal law, the states could operate as they chose. This is arguably one of the greatest creations within the Constitution, this idea of federalism. But Washington would be the first president to have to deal with issues pertaining to federalism. And we're going to cover one of those major issues here as we wrap up this fireside chat. But to strengthen the United States' domestic powers, Washington would turn to one of his all-star cabinet members, Alexander Hamilton. And Washington empowered Hamilton to create an economic plan that would strengthen the United States' position, not just domestically, but also in terms of foreign countries. But here we go. This is a big deal, and we're going to hammer this home to close out this fireside chat. So Washington entrusts Hamilton to create this economic plan, and there are 4 tenets of Hamilton's economic plan. The first part is that Hamilton wanted to pursue an economy that was rooted in manufacturing. The factory system was on the verge of burgeoning in the United States, and we're going to talk about that later when we get into a topic known as the market revolution. But by the end of the 1780s and early 1790s, the American economy was becoming increasingly more factory-driven and manufactured-based. the Industrial Revolution was raging in Europe, and so therefore what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. And those factors would start to increasingly affect and impact the United States. Hamilton was all in on the side of manufacturing. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson, for example, who proved to become one of Hamilton's greatest political adversaries and would ultimately resign from Washington's all-star cabinet over disputes with Washington about the French and Hamilton about his economic plan. Jefferson, for example, was all about the agrarian, agricultural-based United States, but not Hamilton. He was all in on factories and manufacturing. So that's point number one. Point number two, Hamilton decided that the United States federal government, and this ties back to the issue of federalism, would consolidate or absorb all states' debts that they incurred during the American Revolution. This was a shocking, broad stroke that many felt was overstepping the powers of the new United States government. But Hamilton, using the literal powers invested, as well as the figurative powers invested within the American Constitution that gave Congress the ability to regulate the economy, used and created a plan in which all state debt would be taken on by the federal government. And this absolved the states of some of the financial burden and allowed the new United States federal government a chance to give the states some breathing room, while also allowing for the new federal government an opportunity to establish a line of credit debt. And that would be key for the United States to gain some financial credibility around the world. So Hamilton was very shrewd in that concept, even if it did cost a little bit of controversy about the extension of power of the federal government. So that's a key continuity we're going to be looking at throughout the year, extension of federal power, and more on that coming here. The third part of Hamilton's program was the creation of a national bank. Hamilton pushed for a new United States central bank that would help regulate prices, that would help regulate interest and finance rates. And so that was a brand new concept that came out of Hamilton's plan. The bank had a 20-year charter, so it had to be renewed eventually. Foreshadowing, that's going to be a really controversial point when we get into the early 1800s. But for now, the United States would have its first ever national bank. And the fourth and most aggressive part of Hamilton's plan was a direct revenue tax on whiskey. Hamilton gambled big time here, and you have to remember that the scars of the Acts of Parliament and the mercantile policies after the end of salutary neglect were certainly fresh wounds for many Americans. But Hamilton, he was confident in his plan, and so he proposed the plan that would put a direct tax on whiskey. Well, this irked and alienated many farmers in certain parts of the United States, because the whiskey tax directly impeded their opportunity to grow a business. And so ultimately, from about 1791 to 1794, for about 3 solid years, American farmers, mostly grain and wheat farmers that were part of the process of creating whiskey, and corn as well, because bourbon comes from corn, these farmers revolted against the government and actually formed their own sort of quasi-army, which led to one of the most shocking revelations of George Washington's presidency. And George Washington will forever, perhaps, go down in history as being the only American president while in office to get on horseback, in military uniform, and lead an army in order to quell the Whiskey Rebellion. No president since Washington has engaged in any type of military activity. Could you imagine one of our more recent presidents hopping in at F-16 to conduct a raid over the Middle East during our war in Iraq or something along those lines? It would be unheard of, and you would never, ever, ever see it. But back then, George Washington, I guess, couldn't shed his military commander status. He marched a group of troops on the Whiskey Rebellion to help put that down. In the end, no shots, no deaths. It was a bloodless sort of uprising, but the tax would eventually prove that the new United States government was here to stay, that the United States government was taking serious its role and putting right into practice the powers which the Constitution outlined. And that's the big takeaway. Hamilton's plan and the actions of George Washington throughout the course of his 2 presidencies demonstrated that the Constitution had some flex to it, that things were written there but could be bent, that could be slightly maneuvered and massaged a bit. And as a continuity, we will look at all throughout APUSH. It's how do the powers of the government expand at times, and when does that expansion lead to friction, which it did in the Whiskey Rebellion. All things aside, great recap here of what was going on in Washington's presidency. For my students, we'll be doing a team trivia activity, and for those of you watching outside of BOAS, I wish you all a good continued progress through period 3. We'll be wrapping up period 3 this week with my crew with an LEQ at the end of the week. And so I end things as I always do here on this fireside chat. As a reminder, the past shapes the future. Take care, APUSH Nation. Hope you had a great Halloween, and it's going to be November in the next couple of days. So have a great afternoon, evening, wherever you're watching. Take care.